When Randy toured with Ozzy, he was on salary. In the very beginning, it was probably just $100 per week. That's how much Vivian Campbell and Jakey Lee received when they played with Dio and Ozzy. Jakey Lee talked about how miserable his salary was in Ozzy's band. Here's the quote: "My girlfriend, a cocktail waitress, and I make about the same as she does in a night. So you could probably guess about what I make." So, generally speaking, in the 80s, that's what hired musicians on tour were paid, even if they played for big names like Ozzy and Dio. Unless you were a star and you had your own band, you got about $100 a week. When Randy joined Ozzy, Ozzy was a big name while Randy was relatively unknown. In 1979, Randy was just a local hero on the Sunset Strip. Ozzy was signed to Jet Records, whose boss was legendary feared promoter Don Arden, who also managed Black Sabbath from the early 70s through much of the 80s. So, Don Arden invested his money into the band. His daughter Sharon became the manager and Osbourne's wife a few years later. But in 1980, the band was managed by Arden's son, David. They brought Randy to England where he, Bob Daisley, Lee Kerslake, and Ozzy started writing songs for their first album, Blizzard of Oz. And Don Arden paid all Randy's bills and expenses: a flat in London, food, transport, and other things. At that point, the band didn't make any money yet. So when they recorded the album and started touring, that's when the money started rolling in. In the early days before Paranoid, Black Sabbath didn't have any money either. This is what Bill Ward recalls. "We'd done the Paranoid demo and moved managers to Tony Hall and Patrick Meehan. We were pretty much hand to mouth before that point. The only time we started to see money was when we hooked up with Patrick. We'd get £500 after a gig and we'd be like, 'Is this real? You're kidding. We hadn't seen that much money in 2 years.' In 1970, that was huge money. £500 in 1970 is worth about £9,700 today. When we wanted money, we just go and ask Pat for some. There is no accounting or anything." Although later Ozzy complained about how miserable money Black Sabbath got in the 70s, he shouldn't forget that all the coke they got wasn't for free. Now let's go back to Randy. So, when Randy started touring with Ozzy, he was getting about $300 a week. After Randy tragically died in the plane crash, Randy's personal belongings, included his wallet, were recorded by the Leesburg police. This is what his brown wallet contained: one Visa credit card, one American Express card, a Robinson's credit card, plus one check for $1,141.88, and $300 cash and other identification. Besides, there is a brown music case with sheet music and tape recorder and extra tape, plus one portable music stand. Don't forget that $1,100 in 1982 is equivalent in purchasing power to about $3,500 in 2024, and $300 is worth about $1,000 now. So the $300 in the wallet were most likely Randy's weekly pay for concerts. That's what most musicians on tour get paid after paying for stage crew, lights, security, hotel, bus, and all the other expenses that must be paid. $250 to $300 was the normal pay a week for most touring bands. So, Randy received good money from touring. He could buy a guitar, gear, clothes, dinner, but of course he couldn't afford a mansion or luxury things. Randy's friend Rudy Saro recalls that before he joined Ozzy, he was just a poor kid who slept on the floor in Kevin Dubrov's flat. When Rudy joined Ozzy's band, Ozzy didn't even know his last name. All he knew that Rudy was from Cuba. Ozzy had just done an interview with Circus Magazine where he said, "We got Tommy Aldridge on drums, Randy Rhoads, and Rudy from Cuba." This is what Rudy recalls about his stint in Ozzy's band. I had no resume. They trusted Randy. I had never done anything. And here I am, from sleeping on the floor. I had the audition that night. I'm living with Sharon and Ozzy and her dad, Don Arden, in this huge mansion in Beverly Hills. Before Ozzy, Rudy was struggling in Los Angeles. Things were going very slow. But with a band like Ozzy, it was like going at the speed of the Concorde. And as we know, Randy Jackson's model looked like the Concorde, the aircraft on which Randy returned to the United States from the United Kingdom. Rudy would call Kevin DuBrow every week and ask, "Oh, what's new?" And Kevin would go, "Oh, nothing. So what's new with you?" And Rudy would be telling him about all the gigs and everything cool. And Kevin would say, "I hate you." So that obviously really cool to be with Ozzy. Big stages, hotels, jets, fans, etc. As for songwriting and performance royalties, Bob Daisley says they didn't get them. This is what Bob says. As for Randy's, Lee Kerslake's, and my royalties, no, we didn't get paid. We are meant to and are owed our performance royalties, but still haven't been paid. I know that Mrs. Rhoads was suing the Osbourne during the 80s and early 90s, but I don't know the outcome fully. We received our songwriting royalties, but not the performance royalties. There is a document for a contract agreement for an Ozzy show in Atlanta, 1982. According to this document, the capacity is 9,500. Ticket prices are $10 to $11. The gross potential is $102,000. Light and sound cost $7,000. Security is $3,450. So after all the expenses, the promoter has to pay Ozzy $6,250 for the performance. Surely, the musicians were not paid equally. Ozzy was the star, so he got a much bigger percentage. Besides, in 1982, Ozzy was managed by Sharon Arden. She took control of the business in place of her father, Don Arden. Arden was very angry. He invested lots of time and money in the project and he wanted more money back. Reportedly, the next time Sharon visited her father, his vicious pet dog savaged her. Bob Daisley actually worked for many years with Ozzy and Sharon. He participated in writing and recording Bark at the Moon. He wrote most of the lyrics for The Ultimate Sin. He recorded bass on No More Tears. He also worked with Steve Vai in 1994 at Vai Studio on new material for the next Ozzy record, Osmosis. Ozzy eventually recorded Osmosis with Zakk Wylde, and the only track written by Steve Vai which remained on the album is My Little Man. According to Bob, Ozzy and Sharon loved his work but never wanted to pay him his royalties. Steve Vai never got paid for the use of his studio. In 1983, Lee Kerslake and Bob Daisley had started a lawsuit against Jet Records' Don Arden, Sharon's father, for non-payment of royalties from the first two records and lack of appropriate credits on Diary of a Madman. Because Sharon and her father had had a serious falling out and were no longer speaking to each other, Sharon and Ozzy decided to help Lee and Bob with being witnesses in their case to prove that they were meant to get royalties and proper credits. Bob was helping to write and record Bark at the Moon, which was followed by a world tour. By July 1983, Sharon had done a deal with her father to buy the rights and the catalog of the Ozzy records, which Lee and Bob was unaware of. This meant that the Osbournes were now receiving their royalties from those records and were still helping them sue Sharon's father. When the case finally went to court in 1986, Sharon changed her mind and sent into court a signed declaration that Lee and Bob shouldn't be paid but it was to no avail as Lee and Bob won and got a payout from Jet Records' Don Arden, who later declared bankruptcy. Lee and Bob thought then that the credits would be changed and that their royalties would continue. But that didn't happen as the Osbournes owned the rights but still didn't make it known to Bob and Lee. They were on good terms with Ozzy and Sharon and promised many times the credits on Diary of a Madman would be changed in their favor. When Bob was asked to play on Ozzy's next record in 1994, he put in weeks of preparation and rehearsals. He turned down other offers of work, but then he was told, "We're using Geezer now." Sharon promised him a cancellation fee, but he never got it. In 1997, Lee Kerslake and Bob Daisley sought legal advice and were informed of the great strength of our case by very reputable lawyers in LA. For them, it was so hard to sue the Osbournes, as they were super rich and powerful. According to Bob Daisley, around 1999-2000, Don Arden contacted him offering to help in their case against the Osbournes. Lee and Bob met with Arden in London. It was then that Arden told them about Sharon changing Randy's contract soon after he was killed in the plane crash. Not long after that, Don made up with Sharon and turned against Bob and Lee, saying that they'd offered him money to lie. What a nice family. Bob Daisley says that it's very sad that Randy's mother, Dolores, had to file a lawsuit in the 80s to get what her son was owed. She later told Bob, "I just ran out of money, patience, and it all became too much." Randy actually wanted to leave Ozzy. Don Arden wanted Ozzy and his band to record a whole album of Black Sabbath songs live, but Randy didn't like the idea. He was contracted to Ozzy and Sharon and felt trapped. He hated it. When Ozzy found out that Randy wanted to leave, he punched him in the face saying, "You're an ungrateful little crap." So, in 1982, Randy Rhoads didn't make much money yet, but he was at that point of starting to make some real money. He was becoming a star. He wasn't endorsed by any guitar company at that point yet. So he wanted to leave Ozzy to study classical guitar or maybe start his own project.